if the man could not raise more than a flicker of concern when his cat was exploded in the dining room, what chance had it got of ever breaking the bastard? There was one last opportunity left. It was approaching Christ's Mass, and Jack's children would be coming home to the bosom of the family. Perhaps they could convince him that all was not well with the world. Perhaps they could get their fingernails under his flawless indifference and begin to break him down. Hoping against hope, the Yattering sat out the weeks to late December, planning its attacks with all the imaginative malice it could muster. Meanwhile, Jack's life sauntered on. He seemed to live apart from his experience, living his life as an author might write a preposterous story, never involving himself in the narrative too deeply. In several significant ways, however, he showed his enthusiasm for the coming holiday. He cleared his daughters' rooms immaculately. He made their beds up with sweet-smelling linen. He cleaned every speck of cat's blood out of the carpet. He even set up a Christmas tree in the lounge, hung with iridescent balls, tinsel, and presents. Once in a while, as he went about the preparations, Jack thought of the game he was playing and quietly calculated the odds against him. In the days to come, he would have to measure not only his own suffering, but that of his daughters against the possible victory. And always, when he made these calculations, the chance of victory seemed to outweigh the risks. So he continued to write his life and waited. Snow came, soft pats of it against the windows, against the door. Children arrived to sing carols, and he was generous to them. It was possible, for a brief time, to believe in peace on earth. Late in the evening of the 23rd of December, the daughters arrived, in a flurry of cases and kisses. The youngest, Amanda, arrived home first. From its vantage point on the landing, the Yattering viewed the young woman balefully. She didn't look like ideal material in which to induce a breakdown. In fact, she looked dangerous. Gina followed an hour or two later, a smoothly polished woman of the world at 24. She looked every bit as intimidating as her sister. They came into the house with their bustle and their laughter. They rearranged the furniture. They threw out the junk food in the freezer. They told each other and their father how much they had missed each other's company. Within the space of a few hours, the drab house was repainted with light and fun and love. It made the Yattering sick. Whimpering, it hid its head in the bedroom to block out the din of affection, but the shock waves enveloped it. All it could do was sit and listen and refine its revenge. Jack was pleased to have his beauties home. Amanda, so full of opinions and so strong, like her mother. Gina, more like his mother, poised, perceptive. He was so happy in their presence, he could have wept. And here was he, the proud father, putting them both at such risk. But what was the alternative? If he had cancelled the Christmas celebrations, it would have looked highly suspicious. It might even have spoiled his whole strategy, wakening the enemy to the trick that was being played. No, he must sit tight, play dumb, the way the enemy had come to expect him to be. The time would come for action. At 3:15 on Christmas morning, the Yattering opened hostilities by throwing Amanda out of bed. A paltry performance at best, but it had the intended effect. Sleepily rubbing her bruised head, she climbed back into bed, only to have the bed buck and shake and fling her off again like an unbroken colt. The noise woke the rest of the house. Gina was first in her sister's room. "What's going on?" "There's somebody under the bed." "What?" Gina picked up a paperweight from the dresser and demanded the assailant come out. The Yattering, invisible, sat on the window seat and made obscene gestures at the women, tying knots in its genitalia. Gina peered under the bed. The Yattering was clinging to the light fixture now, persuading it to swing backward and forward, making the room reel. "There's nothing there." "There is." Amanda knew. Oh, yes, she knew. "There's something here, Gina," she said. "Something in the room with us. I'm sure of it." No, Gina was absolute. "It's empty." Amanda was searching behind the wardrobe when Polo came in. "What's all the din?" "There's something in the house, Daddy. I was thrown out of bed." Jack looked at the crumpled sheets, the dislodged mattress, then at Amanda. This was the first test. He must lie as casually as possible. "Looks like you've been having nightmares, Beauty," he said, affecting an innocent smile. "There was something under the bed," Amanda insisted. "There's nobody here now." "But I felt it." "Well, I'll check the rest of the house," he offered, without enthusiasm for the task. "You two stay here, just in case." As Polo left the room, the Yattering rocked the light a little more. "Subsidence," said Gina. It was cold downstairs, and Polo could have done without padding around barefoot on the kitchen tiles, but he was quietly satisfied that the battle had been joined in such a petty manner. He'd half feared that the enemy would turn savage with such tender victims at hand. But no, he had judged the mind of the creature quite accurately. It was one of the lower orders, powerful but slow, capable of being inveigled beyond the limits of its control. "Carefully does it," he told himself. "Carefully does it." He traipsed through the entire house, dutifully opening cupboards and peering behind the furniture, then returned to his daughters, who were sitting at the top of the stairs. Amanda looked small and pale, not the 22-year-old woman she was, but a child again. "Nothing doing," he told her with a smile. "It's Christmas morning, and all through the house," Gina finished the rhyme. "Nothing is stirring, not even a mouse." "Not even a mouse, Beauty." At that moment, the Yattering took its cue to fling a vase off the lounge mantelpiece. Even Jack jumped. "Shit," he said. He needed some sleep, but quite clearly the Yattering had no intention of letting them alone just yet. "Que sera," he murmured, scooping up the pieces of the Chinese vase and putting them in a piece of newspaper. "The house is sinking a little on the left side, you know," he said more loudly. "It has been for years." "Subsidence," said Amanda with quiet certainty, "would not throw me out of my bed." Gina said nothing. The options were limited, the alternatives unattractive. "Well, maybe it was Santa Claus," said Polo, attempting levity. He parceled up the pieces of the vase and wandered through into the kitchen, certain that he was being shadowed every step of the way. "What else can it be?" He threw the question over his shoulder as he stuffed the newspaper into the waste bin. "The only other explanation..." Here, He became almost elated by his skimming so close to the truth. The only other possible explanation is too preposterous for words. It was an exquisite irony, denying the existence of the invisible world in the full knowledge that even now it breathed vengefully down his neck. "You mean poltergeist?" said Gina. "I mean anything that goes bang in the night. But we're grown-up people, aren't we? We don't believe in boogeymen." "No," said Gina flatly. "I don't. But I don't believe the house is subsiding either." "Well, it'll have to do for now," said Jack with nonchalant finality. "Christmas starts here. We don't want to spoil it talking about gremlins now, do we?" They laughed together. Gremlins? That's surely a bit deep. To call the hellspawn a gremlin. The Yattering, weak with frustration, acid tears boiling on its intangible cheeks, ground its teeth and kept its peace. There would be time yet to beat that atheistic smile off Jack Bolo's smooth, fat face. Time aplenty. No half measures from now on, no subtlety. It would be an all-out attack. Let there be blood. Let there be agony. They'd all break. Amanda was in the kitchen, preparing Christmas dinner, when the Yattering mounted its next attack. Through the house drifted the sound of King's College Choir. "O little son of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie." The presents had been opened. The G&Ts were being downed. The house was one warm embrace from roof to cellar. In the kitchen, a sudden chill permeated the heat and the steam, making Amanda shiver. She crossed to the window, which was ajar, to clear the air, and closed it. Maybe she was catching something. The Yattering watched her back as she busied herself about the kitchen, enjoying the domesticity for a day. Amanda felt the stare quite clearly. She turned round. Nobody. Nothing. She continued to wash the Brussels sprouts, cutting into one with a worm curled in the middle. She drowned it. The choir sang on. In the lounge, Jack was laughing with Gina about something. Then, a noise. A rattling at first, followed by a beating of somebody's fists against a door. Amanda dropped the knife into the bowl of sprouts and turned from the sink, following the sound. It was getting louder all the time, like something locked in one of the cupboards, desperate to escape. A cat caught in the box, or a bird. It was coming from the oven. Amanda's stomach turned as she began to imagine the worst. Had she locked something in the oven when she'd put in the turkey? She called for her father as she snatched up the oven cloth and stepped toward the cooker, which was rocking with the panic of its prisoner. She had visions of a basted cat leaping out at her, its fur burned off its flesh, half-cooked. Jack was at the kitchen door. "There's something in the oven," she said to him, as though he needed telling. The cooker was in a frenzy. Its thrashing contents had all but beaten off the door. He took the oven cloth from her. "This is a new one," he thought. "You're better than I judged you to be. This is clever. This is original." Gina was in the kitchen now. "What's cooking?" she clicked. But the joke was lost as the cooker began to dance, and the pans of boiling water were twitched off the burners onto the floor. Scalding water seared Jack's leg. He yelled, stumbling back into Gina before diving at the cooker with a yell that wouldn't have shamed a samurai. The oven handle was slippery with heat and grease, but he seized it and flung the door down. A wave of steam and blistering heat rolled out of the oven, smelling of succulent turkey fat. But the bird inside had apparently no intentions of being eaten. It was flinging itself from side to side on the roasting tray, tossing gouts of gravy in all directions. Its crisp brown wings pitifully flailed and flapped. Its legs beat a tattoo on the roof of the oven. Then it seemed to sense the open door. Its wings stretched themselves out to either side of its stuffed bulk, and it half hopped, half fell onto the oven door in a mockery of its living self. Headless, oozing stuffing and onions, it flopped around as though nobody had told the damn thing it was dead, while the fat still bubbled on its bacon-strewn back. Amanda screamed. Jack dived for the door as the bird lurched into the air, blind but vengeful. What it intended to do once it reached its 3 cowering victims was never discovered. Gina dragged Amanda into the hallway with her father in hot pursuit, and the door was slammed closed as the blind bird flung itself against the paneling, beating on it with all its strength. Gravy seeped through the gap at the bottom of the door, dark and fatty. The door had no lock, but Jack reasoned that the bird was not capable of turning the handle. As he backed away, breathless, he cursed his confidence. The opposition had more up its sleeve than he'd guessed. Amanda was leaning against the wall, sobbing, her face stained with splotches of turkey grease. All she seemed able to do was deny what she'd seen, shaking her head and repeating the word no like a talisman against the ridiculous horror that was still throwing itself against the door. Jack escorted her through to the lounge. The radio was still crooning carols which blotted out the din of the bird, but their promises of goodwill seemed small comfort. Gina poured a hefty brandy for her sister and sat beside her on the sofa, plying her with spirits and reassurance in about equal measure. They made little impression on Amanda. "What was that?" Gina asked her father, in a tone that demanded an answer. "I don't know what it was," Jack replied. "Mass hysteria?" Gina's displeasure was plain. Her father had a secret. He knew what was going on in the house, but he was refusing to cough up for some reason. "What do I call? The police or an exorcist?" "Neither." "For God's sake, there's nothing going on, Gina." "Really?" Her father turned from the window and looked at her. His eyes spoke what his mouth refused to say, that this was war. Jack was afraid. The house was suddenly a prison. The game was suddenly lethal. The enemy, instead of playing foolish games, meant harm, real harm, to them all. In the kitchen, the turkey had at last conceded defeat. The carols on the radio had withered into a sermon on God's benedictions. What had been sweet was sour and dangerous. He looked across the room at Amanda and Gina. Both, for their own reasons, were trembling. Polo wanted to tell them, wanted to explain what was going on. But the thing must be there, he knew, gloating. He was wrong. The yattering had retired to the attic, well satisfied with its endeavors. The bird, it felt, had been a stroke of genius. Now it could rest a while, recuperate, let the enemy's nerves tatter themselves in anticipation. Then, in its own good time, it would deliver the coup de grace. Idly, It wondered if any of the inspectors had seen his work with the turkey. Maybe they would be impressed enough by the Yattering's originality to improve its job prospects. Surely it hadn't gone through all those years of training simply to chase half-witted imbeciles like Polo. There must be something more challenging available than that. It felt victory in its invisible bones, and it was a good feeling. The pursuit of Polo would surely gain momentum now. His daughters would convince him, if he wasn't now quite convinced, that there was something terrible afoot. He would crack. He would crumble. Maybe he'd go classically mad. Tear out his hair, rip off his clothes, smear himself with his own excrement. Oh, yes, victory was close. And wouldn't his masters be loving then? Wouldn't it be showered with praise and power? One more manifestation was all that was required. One final, inspired intervention, and Polo would be so much blubbering flesh. Tired, but confident, the Yattering descended into the lounge. Amanda was lying full length on the sofa, asleep. She was obviously dreaming about the turkey. Her eyes rolled beneath her gossamer lids. Her lower lip trembled. Gina sat beside the radio, which was silenced now. She had a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. The gherkin importer wasn't in the room. Wasn't that his footstep on the stair? Yes. He was going upstairs to relieve his brandy-full bladder. Ideal timing. The Yattering crossed the room. In her sleep, Amanda dreamed something dark, flitting across her vision, something malign, something that tasted bitter in her mouth. Gina looked up from her book. The silver balls on the tree were rocking gently. Not just the balls, the tinsel, and the branches, too. In fact, the tree. The whole tree was rocking as though someone had just seized hold of it. Gina had a very bad feeling about this. She stood up. The book slid to the floor. The tree began to spin. "Christ," she said. "Jesus Christ." Amanda slept on. The tree picked up momentum. Gina walked as steadily as she could across to the sofa and tried to shake her sister awake. Amanda, locked in her dreams, resisted for a moment. "Father," said Gina. Her voice was strong and carried through into the hall. It also woke Amanda. Downstairs, Polo heard a noise like a whining dog. No, like two whining dogs. As he ran down the stairs, the duet became a trio. He burst into the lounge, half expecting all the hosts of hell to be in there, dog-headed, dancing on his beauties. But no, it was the Christmas tree that was whining like a pack of dogs as it spun and spun. The lights had long since been pulled from their sockets. The air stank of singed plastic and pine sap. The tree itself was spinning like a top, flinging decorations and presents off its tortured branches with the largesse of a mad king. Jack tore his eyes from the spectacle of the tree and found Gina and Amanda crouching, terrified, behind the sofa. "Get out of here!" he yelled. Even as he spoke, the television sat up impertinently on one leg and began to spin like the tree, gathering momentum quickly. The clock on the mantelpiece joined the pirouetting. The pokers beside the fire, the cushions, the ornaments, each object added its own singular note to the orchestration of whines which were building up second by second to a deafening pitch. The air began to brim with the smell of burning wood as friction heated the spinning tops to flash point. Smoke swirled across the room. Gina had Amanda by the arm and was dragging her toward the door, shielding her face against the hail of pine needles that the still accelerating tree was throwing off. Now the lights were spinning. The books, having flung themselves off the shelves, had joined the tarantella. Jack could see the enemy in his mind's eye, racing between the objects like a juggler spinning plates on sticks, trying to keep them all moving at once. It must be exhausting work, he thought. The demon was probably close to collapse. It couldn't be thinking straight. Overexcited, impulsive, vulnerable. This must be the moment, if ever there was a moment, to join battle at last, to face the thing, defy it, and trap it. For its part, the Yatterman was enjoying this orgy of destruction. It flung every movable object into the fray, setting everything spinning. It watched with satisfaction as the daughters twitched and scurried. It laughed to see the old man stare pop-eyed at this preposterous ballet. Surely he was nearly mad, wasn't he? The beauties had reached the door, their hair and skin full of needles. Polo didn't see them leave. He ran across the room, dodging a rain of ornaments to do so, and picked up a brass toasting fork, which the enemy had overlooked. Bric-a-brac filled the air around his head, dancing around with sickening speed. His flesh was bruised and punctured, but the exhilaration of joining battle had overtaken him, and he set about, beating the books and the clocks and the china to smithereens. Like a man in a cloud of locusts, he ran around the room, bringing down his favorite books in a welter of fluttering pages, smashing whirling Dresden, shattering the lamps. A litter of broken possessions swamped the floor, some of it still twitching as the life went out of the fragments. But for every object brought low, there were a dozen still spinning, still whining. He could hear Gina at the door yelling to him to get out, to leave it alone. But it was so enjoyable, playing against the enemy more directly than he had ever allowed himself before. He didn't want to give up. He wanted the demon to show itself, to be known, to be recognized.
Hey, Chris.
He wanted confrontation with the old one's emissary once and for all. Without warning, the tree gave way to the dictates of centrifugal force and exploded. The noise was like a howl of death. Branches, twigs, needles, balls, lights, wire, ribbons flew across the room. Jack, his back to the explosion,
I ain't got nothing
felt
growing
a gust
yet.
of energy hit him hard, and he was flung to the ground.
And I
The
don't
back
know
of
who
his
TJ
neck and his
is,
scalp
so.
was shot full of pine needles. A branch, naked of greenery, shot past his head and impaled the sofa. Fragments of tree pattered to the carpet around him. Now other objects around the room, spun beyond the tolerance of their structures, were exploding like the tree. The television blew up, sending a lethal wave of glass across the room, much of which buried itself in the opposite wall. Fragments of the television's innards, so hot they singed the skin, fell on Jack as he elbowed himself toward the door like a soldier under bombardment. The room was so thick with a barrage of shards it was like a fog. The cushions had leant there down to the scene, snowing on the carpet. Porcelain pieces, a beautifully glazed arm, a courtesan's head, bounced on the floor in front of his nose. Gina was crouching at the door, urging him to hurry. Her eyes narrowed against the hail. As Jack reached the door and felt her arms around him, he swore he could hear laughter from the lounge.
I still don't know who you are, dude.
Audible laughter, rich and satisfied. Amanda was standing in the hall, her hair full of pine needles, staring down at him. He pulled his legs through the doorway, and Gina slammed the door shut on the demolition. "What is it?" she demanded. Poltergeist? Ghost? Mother's ghost? The thought of his dead wife
I think you might have me
responsible
confused with someone
for
else,
such
dude.
wholesale destruction struck Jack as funny. Amanda was half smiling. Good, he thought. She's coming out of it.
Cause it all
Then
depends
he met the
where,
vacant look
what
in her
state,
eyes,
what,
and the truth dawned.
whatever.
She had broken. Her sanity had taken refuge where this fantastique couldn't get at it. What's in there? Gina was asking, her grip on his arm so strong it stopped the blood. I don't know, he lied. Amanda? Amanda's smile didn't decay. She just stared on at him, through him. You do know. No, you're lying. I think. He picked himself off the floor, brushing the pieces of porcelain, the feathers, the glass, off his shirt and trousers. I think I shall go for a walk. Behind him, in the lounge, the last vestiges of whining had stopped. The air in the hallway was electric with unseen presences.
1 second, I'll be right back.
Close to him, invisible as ever, but so close. This was the most dangerous time. He mustn't lose his nerve now. He must stand up, as though nothing had happened. He must leave Amanda be. Leave explanations and recriminations until it was all over and done with. Walk, Gina said disbelievingly. Yes, walk. I need some fresh air. You can't leave us here. I'll find somebody to help us clear out. But Mandy, she'll get over it. Leave her be. That was hard. That was almost unforgivable. But it was said now. He walked unsteadily toward the front door, feeling nauseated after so much spinning. At his back, Gina was raging. You just can't leave? Are you out of your mind? I need the air, he said, as casually as his thumping heart and his parched throat would permit. So I'll just go out for a moment. No, the yattering said no, no, no. It was behind him. Polo could feel it. So angry now, so ready to twist off his head. Except that it wasn't allowed, ever, to touch him. But he could feel its resentment like a physical presence. He took another step toward the front door. It was with him still, dogging his every step. His shadow, his fetch, unshakable. Gina shrieked at him. You son of a bitch! Look at Mandy! She's lost her mind! No, he mustn't look at Mandy. If he looked at Mandy, he might weep. He might break down as the thing wanted him to. Then everything would be lost. She'll be all right, he said, barely above a whisper. He reached for the front door handle. The demon bolted the door quickly, loudly. No temper left for pretense now. Jack, keeping his movements as even as possible, unbolted the door, top and bottom. It bolted again. It was thrilling, this game. It was also terrifying. If he pushed too far, surely the demon's frustration would override its lessons. Gently, smoothly, he unbolted the door again. Just as gently, just as smoothly, the yattering bolted it. Jack wondered how long he could keep this up for. Somehow, he had to get outside. He had to coax it over the threshold. One step was all that the law required, according to his researches. One simple step. Unbolt it, bolt it, unbolt it, bolt it. Gina was standing 2 or 3 yards behind her father. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but it was obvious her father was doing battle with someone or something. "Daddy," she began. "Shut up," he said benignly, grinning as he unbolted the door for the 7th time. There was a shiver of lunacy in the grin. It was too wide and too easy. Inexplicably, she returned the smile. It was grim, but genuine. Whatever was at issue here, she loved him. Polo made a break for the back door. The demon was 3 paces ahead of him, scooting through the house like a sprinter and bolting the door before Jack could even reach the handle. The key was turned in the lock by invisible hands, then crushed to dust in the air. Jack feigned a move toward the window beside the back door, but the blinds were pulled down and the shutters slammed. The yattering, too concerned with the window to watch Jack closely, missed his doubling back through the house. When it saw the trick that was being played, it let out a little screech and gave chase, almost sliding into Jack on the smoothly polished floor. It avoided the collision only by the most balletic of maneuvers. That would be fatal indeed, to touch the man in the heat of the moment. Polo was again at the front door, and Gina, wise to her father's strategy, had unbolted it while the yattering and Jack fought at the back door. Jack had prayed she'd take the opportunity to open it. She had. It stood slightly ajar. The icy air of the crisp afternoon curled its way into the hallway. Jack covered the last yards to the door in a flash, feeling without hearing the howl of complaint the yattering loosed as it saw its victim escaping into the outside world. It was not an ambitious creature. All it wanted at that moment, beyond any other dream, was to take this human skull between its palms and make a nonsense of it, crush it to smithereens, and pour the hot thought out onto the snow, to be done with Jack J. Polo forever and forever. Was that so much to ask? Polo had stepped into the squeaky fresh snow, his slippers and trouser bottoms buried in chill. By the time the Fury reached the step, Jack was already 3 or 4 yards away, marching up the path toward the gate, escaping. The yattering howled again, forgetting its years of training. Every lesson it had learned, every rule of battle engraved on its skull was submerged by the simple desire to have Polo's life. It stepped over the threshold and gave chase. It was an unpardonable transgression. Somewhere in hell, the powers, long may they hold court, long may they shed light on the heads of the damned, felt the sin and knew the war for Jack Polo's soul was lost. Jack felt it too. He heard the sound of boiling water as the demon's footsteps melted to steam the snow on the path. It was coming after him. The thing had broken the first rule of its existence. It was forfeit. He felt the victory in his spine and his stomach. The demon overtook him at the gate. Its breath could clearly be seen in the air, though the body it emanated from had not yet become visible. Jack tried to open the gate, but the yattering slammed it shut. "Que sera, sera," said Jack. The yattering could bear it no longer. He took Jack's head in his hands, intending to crush the fragile bone to dust. The touch was its second sin, and it agonized the yattering beyond endurance. It bayed like a banshee and reeled away from the contact, sliding in the snow and falling on its back. It knew its mistake. The lessons it had beaten into it came hurtling back. It knew the punishment, too, for leaving the house, for touching the man. It was bound to a new lord, enslaved to this idiot creature standing over it. Polo had won. He was laughing, watching the way the outline of the demon formed in the snow on the path. Like a photograph, developing on a sheet of paper, the image of the fury came clear. The law was taking its toll. The yattering could never hide from its master again. There it was, plain to Polo's eyes, in all its charmless glory. Maroon flesh and bright lidless eye, arms flailing, tail thrashing the snow to slush. "You bastard," it said. Its accent had an Australian lilt. "You will not speak unless spoken to," said Polo with quiet but absolute authority. "Understood?" The lidless eye clouded with humility. "Yes," the yattering said. "Yes, Mr. Polo." "Yes, Mr. Polo." Its tail slipped between its legs like that of a whipped dog. "You may stand." "Thank you, Mr. Polo." It stood, not a pleasant sight, but one Jack rejoiced in nevertheless. "They'll have you yet," said the yattering. "Who will?" "You know," it said hesitantly. "Name them." "Beelzebub," it answered, proud to name its old master. "The powers, hell itself?" "I don't think so," Polo mused. "Not with you bound to me as proof of my skills. Aren't I the better of them?" The eye looked sullen. "Aren't I?" "Yes," it conceded bitterly. "Yes,
Cheers.
you
Oh,
are
you're in
the
Colorado?
better of them." It had begun to shiver. "Are you cold?" asked Polo.
Hey, Chris Summers, how long ago was this?
Child. "Then you need some exercise," he said. "You'd better go back into the house and start tidying up." The fury looked bewildered, even disappointed by this instruction. "Nothing more?" it asked incredulously. "No miracles? No Helen of Troy? No flying?" The thought of flying on a snow-spattered afternoon like this left Polo cold. He was essentially a man of simple tastes. All he asked for in life was the love of his children, a pleasant home, and a good trading price for gherkins. "No flying," he said. As the yattering slouched down the path toward the door, it seemed to alight upon a new piece of mischief. It turned back to Polo, obsequious but unmistakably smug. "Could I just say something?" it said. "Speak." "It's only fair that I inform you that it's considered ungodly to have any contact with the likes of me. Heretical, even." "Is that so?" "Ah, yes," said the yattering, warming to its prophecy. "People have been burned for less." "Not in this day and age," Polo replied. "But the seraphim will see," it said. "And that means you'll never go to that place." "What place?" The yattering fumbled for the special word it had heard Beelzebub use. "Heaven," it said, triumphant. An ugly grin had come onto its face. This was the cleverest maneuver it had ever attempted. It was juggling theology here. Jack nodded slowly, nibbling at his bottom lip. The creature was probably telling the truth. Association with it or its like would not be looked upon benignly by the host of saints and angels. He probably was forbidden access to the plains of paradise. Well, he said, you know what I have to say about that, don't you? The Yattering stared at him, frowning. No, it didn't know. Then the grin of satisfaction it had been wearing died, as it saw just what Polo was driving at. What do I say? Polo asked it. Defeated, the Yattering murmured the phrase. Hi, Cyril. Cyril. Polo smiled. There's a chance for you yet, he said, and led the way over the threshold, closing the door with something very like serenity on his face.
Pig Blood Blues, narrated by Peter Berkrot. You could smell the kids before you could see them. Their young sweat turned stale in corridors with barred windows, their bolted breath sour, their heads musty. Sex, Death, and Star in the Hills, the Cities, narrated by Chet Williamson.
It wasn't until the first week of the Yugoslavian trip that Mick discovered what a political bigot he'd chosen as a lover. Certainly he'd been warned. One of the queens at the baths had told him Judd was to the right of Attila the Hun. But the man had been one of Judd's ex-affairs, and Mick had presumed there was more spite than perception in the character assassination. If only he'd listened. Then he wouldn't be driving along an interminable road in a Volkswagen that suddenly seemed the size of a coffin, listening to Judd's views on Soviet expansionism. Jesus, he was so boring. He didn't converse, he lectured, and endlessly. In Italy, the sermon had been on the way the communists had exploited the peasant vote. Now, in Yugoslavia, Judd had really warmed to this theme, and Mick was just about ready to take a hammer to his self-opinionated head. It wasn't that he disagreed with everything Judd said. Some of the arguments, the ones Mick understood, seemed quite sensible. But then, what did he know? He was a dance teacher. Judd was a journalist, a professional pundit. He felt, like most journalists Mick had encountered, that he was obliged to have an opinion on everything under the sun, especially politics. That was the best trough to wallow in. You could get your snout, eyes, head, and front hooves in that mess of muck and have a fine old time splashing around. It was an inexhaustible subject to devour, a swill with a little of everything in it, because everything, according to Judd, was political. The arts were political, sex was political, religion, commerce, gardening, eating, drinking, and farting, all political. Jesus, it was mind-blowingly boring, killingly, love-deadeningly boring. Worse still, Judd didn't seem to notice how bored Mick had become, or if he noticed, he didn't care. He just rambled on, his arguments getting windier and windier, his sentences lengthening with every mile they drove. Judd, Mick had decided, was a selfish bastard, and as soon as their honeymoon was over, he'd part with the guy. It was not until their trip, that endless, motiveless caravan through the graveyards of mid-European culture, that Judd realized what a political lightweight he had in Mick. The guy showed precious little interest in the economics or the politics of the countries they passed through. He registered indifference to the full facts behind the Italian situation and yawned, yes, yawned, when he tried and failed to debate the Russian threat to world peace. He had to face the bitter truth. Mick was a queen. There was no other word for him. All right, perhaps he didn't mince or wear jewelry to excess, but he was a queen nevertheless, happy to wallow in a dream world of early Renaissance frescoes and Yugoslavian icons. The complexities, the contradictions, even the agonies that made those cultures blossom and wither were just tiresome to him. His mind was no deeper than his looks. He was a well-groomed nobody. Some honeymoon. The road south from Belgrade to Novi Pazar was, by Yugoslavian standards, a good one. There were fewer potholes than on many of the roads they'd traveled, and it was relatively straight. The town of Novi Pazar lay in the valley of the river Raska, south of the city named after the river.
I know all that.
It wasn't an
talk.
area particularly popular with the tourists. Despite the good road, it was still
I read the
inaccessible
books before
and
I saw the
lacked
movie.
sophisticated amenities. But Mick was determined to see the monastery at Sobocani, to the west of the
certain
town,
books
and
are part
after
of
some bitter argument,
the books
it
of
won.
Blood Volume.
The journey had
volumes.
proved uninspiring. On either side of the road, the cultivated
This
fields
is just Volume
looked
1, I
parched
think. If I
and
remember
dusty.
right, I think they have 7
The
or 8
summer
volumes.
had been unusually hot, and droughts
I
were
haven't been
affecting
doing too
many of
bad.
the villages. Crops
Can't
had
complain too
failed,
much.
and livestock had been prematurely slaughtered to prevent them dying of malnutrition. There was a defeated look about the few faces they glimpsed at the roadside. Even the children had dour expressions, brows as heavy as the stale heat that hung over the valley. Now, with the cards on the table after a row at Belgrade, they drove in silence most of the time. But the straight road, like most straight roads, invited dispute. When the driving was easy, the mind rooted for something to keep it engaged. What better than a fight? "Why the hell do you want to see this damn monastery?" Judd demanded. It was an unmistakable invitation. "We've come all this way." Mick tried to keep the tone conversational. He wasn't in the mood for an argument. "More fucking virgins, is it?" Keeping his voice as even as he could, Mick picked up the guide and read aloud from it. There, some of the greatest works of Serbian painting can still be seen and enjoyed, including what many commentators agree to be the enduring masterpiece of the Raska school, the Dormition of the Virgin. Silence.
What is it?
Then Judd.
The movie,
What to hear with churches.
The
It's a
Midnight Meat
masterpiece.
Train.
They're all masterpieces, according to that bloody book.
It's actually a
Mick felt his control
Clive
slipping.
Barker
2.5
story that's
hours
actually
at most. I told
in
you,
the books
I
of
don't
Blood
want
volumes.
to see another church. The smell of the places makes me sick. Stale incense, old sweat, and lies. It's a short detour. Then we can get back onto the road, and you can give me another lecture on farming subsidies in the Sanzak. I'm just trying to get some decent conversation going, instead of this endless tripe about Serbian fucking masterpieces. Stop the car. What? Stop the car. Judd pulled the Volkswagen into the side of the road. Mick got out. The road was hot, but there was a breeze. He took a deep breath and wandered into the middle of the road, empty of traffic and of pedestrians in both directions. In every direction, empty. The hills shimmered in the heat off the fields. There were wild poppies growing in the ditches. Mick crossed the road, squatted on his haunches, and picked one. Behind him he heard the VW's door slam. "What did you stop us for?" Judd said. His voice was edgy, still hoping for that argument, begging for it. Mick stood up, playing with the poppy. It was close to seeding, late in the season. The petals fell from the receptacle as soon as he touched them, little splashes of red fluttering down onto the gray tarmac. "I asked you a question," Judd said again. Mick looked around. Judd was standing the far side of the car, his brows a knitted line of burgeoning anger. But handsome. Oh yes, a face that made women weep with frustration that he was gay. A heavy black mustache, perfectly trimmed, and eyes you could watch forever and never see the same light in them twice. Why, in God's name, thought Mick, does a man as fine as that have to be such an insensitive little shit? Judd returned the look of contemptuous appraisal, staring at the pouting pretty boy across the road. It made him want to puke, seeing the little act Mick was performing for his benefit. It might just have been plausible in a 16-year-old virgin. In a 25-year-old, it lacked credibility. Mick dropped the flower and untucked his T-shirt from his jeans. A tight stomach, then a slim, smooth chest were revealed as he pulled it off. His hair was ruffled when his head reappeared, and his face wore a broad grin. Judd looked at the torso. Neat, not too muscular. An appendix scar peering over his faded jeans. A gold chain, small but catching the sun, dipped in the hollow of his throat. Without meaning to, he returned Mick's grin, and a kind of peace was made between them. Mick was unbuckling his belt. "Want to fuck?" he said, the grin not faltering. "It's no use," came an answer, though not to that question. "What isn't?" "We're not compatible." "Want a bet?" Now he was unzipped and turning away toward the wheat field that bordered the road. Judd watched as Mick cut a swath through the swaying sea, his back the color of the grain, so that he was almost camouflaged by it. It was a dangerous game, screwing in the open air. This wasn't San Francisco or even Hampstead Heath. Nervously, Judd glanced along the road, still empty in both directions, and Mick was turning deep in the field, turning and smiling and waving like a swimmer buoyed up in a golden surf. What the hell? There was nobody to see, nobody to know. Just the hills, liquid in the heat haze, their forested backs bent to the business of the earth, and a lost dog sitting at the edge of the road, waiting for some lost master. Judd followed Mick's path through the wheat, unbuttoning his shirt as he walked. Field mice ran ahead of him, scurrying through the stalks as the giant came their way, his feet like thunder. Judd saw their panic and smiled. He meant no harm to them. But then, how were they to know that? Maybe he'd put out 100 lives, mice, beetles, worms, before he reached the spot where Mick was lying, stark, bollock naked, on a bed of trampled grain, still grinning. It was good love they made, good, strong love, equal in pleasure for both. There was a precision to their passion, sensing the moment when effortless delight became urgent, when desire
under our feet. Byer's voice was firm and full of belief. He had little imagination, did Jarrett Byer. Death was part of a soldier's life, however it came. Lightnings struck our ranks out of a clear sky. My Lord Captain Commander, what else could they have been? Niall nodded grimly. There had been no male Aes Sedai since the breaking of the world. But the women who still claimed that title were bad enough. They prated on their 3 oaths: to speak no word that was not true, to make no weapon for one man to kill another, to use the one power as a weapon only against dark friends or shadow spawn. But now they had showed those oaths for the lies they were. He'd always known no one could want the power they wielded except to challenge the Creator. That meant to serve the Dark One. And you know nothing of those who took Falma and killed half of one of my legions. Lord Captain Bornhold said they called themselves Shanchan, my Lord Captain Commander, Byer said stolidly. He said they were dark friends, and his charge broke them, even if they killed him. His voice gained intensity. There were many refugees from the city. Everyone I spoke to agreed the strangers had broken and fled. Lord Captain Bornhold did that. Niall sighed softly. They were almost the same words Byer had used the first 2 times about the army that had seemingly come out of nowhere to take Falma. A good soldier, Niall thought. So Geoffrey Bornhold always said. But not a man to think for himself. My Lord Captain Commander, Byer said suddenly. Lord Captain Bornhold did command me to stand aside from the battle. I was to watch and report to you. And tell his son, Lord Dayan, how he died. Yes, yes, Niall said impatiently. For a moment he studied Byers' hollow-cheeked face, then added, No one doubts your honesty or courage. It is exactly the sort of thing Geoffrey Bornhold would do, facing a battle in which he feared his entire command might die. And not the sort of thing you have imagination enough to think up. There was nothing more to learn from the man. You have done well, child Byre. You have my leave to carry word of Geoffrey Bornhold's death to his son. Dane Bornhold is with Eamon Valda, near Tarvallen at last report. You may join them. Thank you, my Lord Captain Commander. Thank you. Byre rose to his feet and bowed deeply. Yet as he straightened, he hesitated. My Lord Captain Commander, we were betrayed. Hatred gave his voice a saw-toothed edge. By this one dark friend you spoke of, child Byre. He could not keep an edge out of his own voice. A year's planning lay in ruins amid the corpses of 1,000 of the children, and Byre wanted to talk only of this one man. This young blacksmith you've only seen twice. This Perrin from the Two Rivers. Yes, my Lord Captain Commander. I do not know how, but I know he is to blame. I know it. I will see what can be done about him, child Byre. Byre opened his mouth again, but Niall raised a thin hand to forestall him. You may leave now. The gaunt-faced man had no choice but to bow again and leave.
But sooner or later, nasty. Written on it was a single word. Alley. Chapter 1. The Gunslinger. 1. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what looked like eternity in all directions.
I'll be right
It was
back.
white and blinding and waterless, and without a feature save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass, which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once, the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway. Coaches and buckas had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. The gunslinger had been struck by a momentary dizziness, a kind of yawing sensation that made the entire world seem ephemeral, almost a thing that could be looked through. It passed, and, like the world upon whose hide he walked, he moved on. He passed the miles stolidly, not hurrying, not loafing. A hide water bag was slung around his middle like a bloated sausage. It was almost full. He had progressed through the Kef over many years and had reached perhaps the 5th level. Had he been a manny holy man, he might not have even been thirsty. He could have watched his own body dehydrate with clinical, detached attention, watering its crevices and dark inner hollows only when his logic told him it must be done. He was not a manny, however, nor a follower of the man Jesus, and considered himself in no way holy. He was just an ordinary pilgrim, in other words, and all he could say with real certainty was that he was thirsty. And even so, he had no particular urge to drink. In a vague way, all this pleased him. It was what the country required. It was a thirsty country. And he had, in his long life, been nothing if not adaptable. Below the water bag were his guns, carefully weighted to his hands. A plate had been added to each when they had come to him from his father, who had been lighter and not so tall. The two belts crisscrossed above his crotch. The holsters were oiled too deeply for even this Philistine's son to crack. The stocks of the guns were sandalwood, yellow and finely grained. Rawhide tie-downs held the holsters loosely to his thighs, and they swung a bit with his step. They had rubbed away the bluing of his jeans and thinned the cloth in a pair of arcs that looked almost like smiles. The brass casings of the cartridges looped into the gun belts, heliographed in the sun. There were fewer now. The leather made subtle, creaking noises. His shirt, the no color of rain or dust, was open at the throat, with a rawhide thong dangling loosely in hand-punched eyelets. His hat was gone. So was the horn he had once carried. Gone for years, from the hand of a dying friend. And he missed them both. He breasted a gently rising dune, although there was no sand here. The desert was hardpan, and even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating, harsh dust like scouring powder, and saw the kicked remains of a tiny campfire on the lee side, the side the sun would quit earliest. Small signs like this, once more affirming the man in black's possible humanity, never failed to please him. His lips stretched in the pitted, flaked remains of his face. The grin was gruesome, painful. He squatted. His quarry had burned the devil grass, of course. It was the only thing out here that would burn. It burned with a greasy, flat light, and it burned slow. Border dwellers had told him that devils lived even in the flames. They burned it, but would not look into the light. They said the devils hypnotized, beckoned, would eventually draw the one who looked into the fires. And the next man foolish enough to look into the fire might see you. The burned grass was crisscrossed in the now familiar ideographic pattern and crumbled to gray senselessness before the gunslinger's prodding hand. There was nothing in the remains but a charred scrap of bacon, which he ate thoughtfully. It had always been this way. The gunslinger had followed the man in black across the desert for 2 months now. Across the endless, screamingly monotonous purgatorial wastes, and had yet to find spoor other than the hygienic, sterile ideographs of the man in black's campfires. He had not found a can, a bottle, or a water bag. The gunslinger had left 4 of those behind, like dead snakeskins. He hadn't found any dung. He assumed the man in black buried it. Perhaps the campfires were a message, spelled out one great letter at a time. Keep your distance, partner, it might say. Or, the end draweth nigh. Or maybe even, come and get me. It didn't matter what they said or didn't say. He had no interest in messages, if messages they were. What mattered was that these remains were as cold as all the others. Yet he had gained. He knew he was closer, but didn't know how he knew. A kind of smell, perhaps. That didn't matter either. He would keep going until something changed. And if nothing changed, he would keep going anyway. There would be water if God willed it, the old-timers said. Water if God willed it, even in the desert. The gunslinger stood up, brushing his hands. No other trace. The wind, razor-sharp, had of course filed away even what scant tracks the hardpan might once have held. No man scat, no cast-off trash, never a sign of where those things might have been buried. Nothing. Only these cold campfires along the ancient highway moving southeast, and the relentless range finder in his own head. Although, of course, it was more than that. The pull southeast was more than just a sense of direction. Was even more than magnetism. He sat down and allowed himself a short pull from the water bag. He thought of that momentary dizziness earlier in the day. that sense of being almost untethered from the world, and wondered what it might have meant. Why should that dizziness make him think of his horn and the last of his old friends, both lost so long ago at Jericho Hill? He still had the guns, his father's guns, and surely they were more important than horns, or even friends. Weren't they? The question was oddly troubling, but since there seemed to be no answer but the obvious one, he put it aside, possibly for later consideration. He scanned the desert and then looked up at the sun, which was now sliding into a far quadrant of the sky that was disturbingly not quite true west. He got up, removed his threadbare gloves from his belt, and began to pull devil grass for his own fire, which he laid over the ashes the man in black had left. He found the irony, like his thirst, bitterly appealing. He did not take the flint and steel from his purse until the remains of the day were only fugitive heat in the ground beneath him and a sardonic orange line on the monochrome horizon. He sat with his gunner drawn across his lap and watched the southeast patiently, looking toward the mountains, not hoping to see the thin, straight line of smoke from a new campfire, not expecting to see an orange spark of flame, but watching anyway, because watching was a part of it, and had its own bitter satisfaction. You will not see what you do not look for, maggot, Court would have said. Open the gobs the gods gave you, will you not? But there was nothing. He was close, but only relatively so, not close enough to see smoke at dusk or the orange wink of a campfire. He laid the flint down the steel rod and struck his spark to the dry, shredded grass, muttering the old and powerful nonsense words as he did. Sparkadark, where's my sire? Will I lay me, will I stay me? Bless this camp with fire. It was strange how some of childhood's words and ways fell at the wayside and were left behind, while others clamped tight and rode for life, growing the heavier to carry as time passed. He lay down upwind of his little blazon, letting the dream smoke blow out toward the waste. The wind, except for occasional gyrating dust devils, was constant. Above, the stars were unwinking, also constant. Suns and worlds by the million. Dizzying constellations, cold fire in every primary hue. As he watched, the sky washed from violet to ebony. A meteor etched a brief, spectacular arc below Old Mother and winked out. The fire threw strange shadows as the devil grass burned its slow way down into new patterns, not ideograms, but a straightforward crisscross, vaguely frightening in its own no-nonsense surety. He had laid his fuel in a pattern that was not artful, but only workable. It spoke of blacks and whites. It spoke of a man who might straighten bad pictures in strange hotel rooms. The fire burned its steady, slow flame, and phantoms danced in its incandescent core. The gunslinger did not see. The two patterns, art and craft, were welded together as he slept. The wind moaned, a witch with cancer in her belly. Every now and then a perverse downdraft would make the smoke whirl and puff toward him, and he breathed some of it in. It built dreams in the same way that a small irritant may build a pearl in an oyster. The gunslinger occasionally moaned with the wind. The stars were as indifferent to this as they were to wars, crucifixions, resurrections. This also would have pleased him. 2. He had come down off the last of the foothills, leading the mule, whose eyes were already dead and bulging with the heat. He had passed the last town 3 weeks before, and since then there had only been the deserted coach track and an occasional huddle of border dwellers' saw dwellings. The huddles had degenerated into single dwellings, most inhabited by lepers or madmen. He found the madmen better company. One had given him a stainless steel silver compass and bade him give it to the man Jesus. The gunslinger took it gravely. If he saw him, he would turn over the compass. He did not expect that he would, but anything was possible. Once he saw a Tahin, this one a man with a raven's head, but the misbegotten thing fled at his hail, cawing what might have been words, what might even have been curses. 5 days had passed since the last hut, and he had begun to suspect there would be no more when he topped the last eroded hill and saw the familiar low-backed sod roof. The dweller, a surprisingly young man with a wild shock of strawberry hair that reached almost to his waist, was weeding a scrawny stand of corn with zealous abandon. The mule let out a wheezing grunt, and the dweller looked up, glaring blue eyes coming target center on the gunslinger in a moment. The dweller was unarmed, with no bolt nor bar the gunslinger could see. He raised both hands in curt salute to the stranger, and then bent to the corn again, humping up the row next to his hut with back bent, tossing devil grass and an occasional stunted corn plant over his shoulder. His hair flopped and flew in the wind that now came directly from the desert, with nothing to break it. The gunslinger came down the hill slowly, leading the mule on which his water-skins sloshed. He paused by the edge of the lifeless-looking corn patch, drew a drink from one of his skins to start the saliva, and spat into the arid soil. Life for your crop. Life for your own, the dweller answered, and stood up. His back popped audibly. He surveyed the gunslinger without fear. The little of his face, visible between beard and hair, seemed unmarked by the rot, and his eyes, while a bit wild, seemed sane. Long days and pleasant nights, stranger. And may you have twice the number. Unlikely, the dweller replied, and voiced a curt laugh. I don't have no but corn and beans, he said. Corn's free, but you'll have to kick something in for the beans. A man brings them out once in a while. He don't stay long. The dweller laughed shortly. Afraid of spirits. Afraid of the Birdman, too. I saw him. The Birdman, I mean. He fled me. Well, he's lost his way. Claims to be looking for a place called Algo Ciento. Only sometimes he calls it Blue Haven or Heaven. I can't make it up. The gunslinger shook his head. Well, he don't bite, and he don't bide. So fuck him. Is he alive or dead? Alive, the gunslinger said. You speak as the Mani do. I was with him a while, but that was no life for me. Too chummy they are, and always looking for holes in the world. This was true. The gunslinger reflected. The Mani folk were great travelers. The two of them looked at each other in silence for a moment, and then the dweller put out his hand. Brown is my name. The gunslinger shook and gave his own name. As he did so, a scrawny raven croaked from the low peak of the sod roof. The dweller gestured at it briefly. That's Zoltan. At the sound of its name, the raven croaked again and flew across to Brown. It landed on the dweller's head and roosted, talons firmly twined in the wild thatch of hair. Screw you, Zoltan croaked brightly. Screw you and the horse you rode in on. The gunslinger nodded amiably. Beans, beans, a musical fruit, the raven recited, inspired. The more you eat, the more you toot. You teach him that? That's all he wants to learn, I guess, Brown said. Tried to teach him the Lord's Prayer once. His eyes traveled out beyond the hut for a moment, toward the gritty, featureless hardpan. Guess this ain't Lord's Prayer country. You're a gunslinger, that right? Yes. He hunkered down and brought out his makings. Zoltan launched himself from Brown's head and landed flittering on the gunslinger's shoulder. Thought your kind was gone. Then you see different, don't you? Did he come from in-world? Long ago, the gunslinger agreed. Anything left there? To this, the gunslinger made no reply, but his face suggested this was a topic better not pursued. After the other one, I guess. Yes. The inevitable question followed, how long since he passed by? Brown shrugged. I don't know. Time's funny out here. Distance and direction, too. More than 2 weeks. Less than 2 months. The Bean Man's been twice since he passed. I guess 6 weeks. That's probably wrong. The more you eat, the more you toot, Zoltan said. Did he lay by? The gunslinger asked. Brown nodded. He stayed supper, same as you will, I guess. We passed the time. The gunslinger stood up, and the bird flew back to the roof, squawking. He felt an odd, trembling eagerness. What did he talk about? Brown cocked an eyebrow at him. Not much. Did it ever rain, and when did I come here, and had I buried my wife? He asked was she of the Mani folk, and I said yeah, because it seemed like he already knew. I did most of the talking, which ain't usual. He paused, and the only sound was the stark wind. He's a sorcerer, ain't he? Among other things. Brown nodded slowly. I knew. He dropped a rabbit out of his sleeve, all gutted and ready for the pot. Are you? A sorcerer? He laughed. I'm just a man. You'll never catch him. I'll catch him. They looked at each other. A sudden depth of feeling between them, the dweller upon his dust-puffed dry ground, the gunslinger on the hard pan that shelved down to the desert. He reached for his flint. Here! Brown produced a sulphur-headed match and struck it with a grimed nail. The gunslinger pushed the tip of his smoke into the flame and drew. Thanks. You'll want to fill your skins, the dweller said, turning away. Spring's under the eaves and back. I'll start dinner. The gunslinger stepped gingerly over the rows of corn and went around back. The spring was at the bottom of a hand-dug well, lined with stones to keep the powdery earth from caving. As he descended the rickety ladder, the gunslinger reflected that the stones must represent 2 years' work easily. Hauling, dragging, laying. The water was clear but slow-moving, and filling the skins was a long chore. While he was topping the second, Zoltan perched on the lip of the well. Screw you and the horse you rode in on, he advised. The gunslinger looked up, startled. The shaft was about 15 feet deep. Easy enough for Brown to drop a rock on him, break his head, and steal everything on him. A crazy or a rotter wouldn't do it. Brown was neither. Yet he liked Brown. And so he pushed the thought out of his mind and got the rest of the water God had willed. Whatever else God willed was Kaa's business, not his. When he came through the hut's door and walked down the steps, the hovel proper was set below ground level, designed to catch and hold the coolness of the nights. Brown was poking ears of corn into the embers of a tiny fire with a crude hardwood spatula. 2 ragged plates had been set at opposite ends of a dun blanket. Water for the beans was just beginning to bubble in a pot hung over the fire. I'll pay for the water, too. Brown did not look up. The water's a gift from God, as I think thee knows. Papa Doc brings the beans. The gunslinger grunted a laugh and sat down with his back against one rude wall, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. After a little, the smell of roasting corn came to his nose. There was a pebbly rattle as Brown dumped a paper of dry beans into the pot. An occasional tuck-tuck-tuck as Zoltan walked restlessly on the roof. He was tired. He had been going 16 and sometimes 18 hours a day between here and the horror that had occurred in Tull, the last village. And he had been afoot for the last 12 days. The mule was at the end of its endurance, only living because it was a habit. Once, he had known a boy named Shimi, who'd had a mule. Shimi was gone now. They were all gone now. And there was only the 2 of them, him and the man in black. He had heard rumor of other lands beyond this, green lands in a place called Midworld. But it was hard to believe. Out here, green lands seemed like a child's fantasy. Tuck, tuck, tuck. 2 weeks, Brown had said, or as many as 6. Didn't matter. There had been calendars in Tull, and they had remembered the man in black because of the old man he had healed on his way through. Just an old man dying of the weed, an old man of 35. And if Brown was right, he had closed a good deal of distance on the man in black since then. But the desert was next. And the desert would be hell. Tuck, tuck, tuck. Lend me your wings, bird. I'll spread them and fly on the thermals. He slept. 3. Brown woke him up an hour later. It was dark. The only light was the dull cherry glare of the banked embers. Your mule is passed on, Brown said. Tell you sorry. Dinner's ready. How? Brown shrugged. Roasted and boiled, how else? You picky? No, the mule. It just laid over, that's all. It looked like an old mule. And with a touch of apology, Zoltan ate the eyes. Oh. He might have expected it. All right. Brown surprised him again when they sat down to the blanket that served as a table by asking a brief blessing. Rain, health, expansion to the spirit. Do you believe in an afterlife? The gunslinger asked him as Brown dropped 3 ears of hot corn onto his plate. Brown nodded. I think this is it. 4. The beans were like bullets, the corn tough. Outside, the prevailing wind snuffled and whined around the ground-level eaves. The gunslinger ate quickly, ravenously, drinking 4 cups of water with the meal. Halfway through, there was a machine gun rapping at the door. Brown got up and let Zoltan in. The bird flew across the room and hunched moodily in the corner. Musical fruit, he muttered. You ever think about eating him? The gunslinger asked. The dweller laughed. Animals that talk be tough, he said. Birds, billy bumblers, human beings, they be tough eatin'. After dinner, the gunslinger offered his tobacco. The dweller, Brown, accepted eagerly. Now, the gunslinger thought, now the questions will come. But Brown asked no questions. He smoked tobacco that had been grown in Garland years before and looked at the dying embers of the fire. It was already noticeably cooler in the hovel. Lead us not into temptation, Zoltan said suddenly, apocalyptically. The gunslinger started as if he had been shot at. He was suddenly sure this was an illusion, that the man in black had spun a spell and was trying to tell him something in a maddeningly obtuse symbolic. You know Tull? He asked suddenly. Brown nodded. Came through it to get here. Went back once to sell corn and drink a glass of whiskey. It rained that year, lasted maybe 15 minutes. The ground just seemed to open and suck it up. An hour later it was just as white and dry as ever, but the corn, God, the corn, you could see it grow. That wasn't so bad, but you could hear it, as if the rain had given it a mouth. It wasn't a happy sound. It seemed to be sighing and groaning its way out of the earth. He paused. I had extra, so I took it and sold it. Papa Doc said he'd do it, but he would have cheated me, so I went. You don't like town? No. I almost got killed there, the gunslinger said. Do you say so? Set my watch and warrant on it. And I killed a man that was touched by God, the gunslinger said. Only it wasn't God. It was the man with the rabbit up his sleeve, the man in black. He laid you a trap. You say true, I say thank you. They looked at each other across the shadows, the moment taking on overtones of finality. Now, the questions will come. But Brown still had no questions to ask. His cigarette was down to a smoldering roach, but when the gunslinger tapped his poke, Brown shook his head. Zoltan shifted restlessly, seemed about to speak, subsided. "Will I tell you about it?" the gunslinger asked. "Ordinarily, I'm not much of a talker, but sometimes talking helps. I'll listen." The gunslinger searched for words to begin and found none. "I have to pass water," he said. Brown nodded. "Pass it in the corn, please." "Sure." He went up the stairs and out into the dark. The stars glittered overhead. The wind pulsed. His urine arched out over the powdery cornfield in a wavering stream. The man in black had drawn him here. It wasn't beyond possibility that Brown was the man in black. He might be. The gunslinger shut these useless and upsetting thoughts away. The only contingency he had not learned how to bear was the possibility of his own madness. He went back inside. "Have you decided if I'm an enchantment yet?" Brown asked, amused. The gunslinger paused on the tiny landing, startled. Then he came down slowly and sat. "The thought crossed my mind. Are you?" "If I am, I don't know it." This wasn't a terribly helpful answer, but the gunslinger decided to let it pass. "I started to tell you about Tull." "Is it growing?" "It's dead," the gunslinger said. "I killed it." He thought of adding, "And now I'm going to kill you, if for no other reason than I don't want to have to sleep with one eye open." But had he come to such behavior? If so, why bother to go on at all? Why, if he had become what he pursued? Brown said, "I don't want nothing from you, gunslinger, except to still be here when you move on. I won't beg for my life, but that don't mean I don't want it yet a while longer." The gunslinger closed his eyes. His mind whirled. "Tell me what you are," he said thickly. "Just a man, one who means you no harm. And I'm still willing to listen if you're willing to talk." To this the gunslinger made no reply. "I guess you won't feel right about it unless I invite you," Brown said. "And so I do. Will you tell me about Tull?" The gunslinger was surprised to find that this time the words were there. He began to speak in flat bursts that slowly spread into an even, slightly toneless narrative. He found himself oddly excited. He talked deep into the night. Brown did not interrupt at all. Neither did the bird. 5. He'd bought the mule in Pricetown, and when he reached Tull, it was still fresh. The sun had set an hour earlier, but the gunslinger had continued traveling, guided by the town glow in the sky, then by the uncannily clear notes of a honky-tonk piano playing Hey Jude. The road widened as it took on tributaries. Here and there were overhead spark lights, all of them long dead. The forests were long gone now, replaced by the monotonous flat prairie country. Endless, desolate fields gone to timothy and low shrubs. Eerie, deserted estates guarded by brooding, shadowed mansions where demons undeniably walked. Leering, empty shanties where the people had either moved on or had been moved along. An occasional dweller's hovel given away by a single flickering point of light in the dark, or by sullen, inbred clan fams toiling silently in the fields by day. Corn was the main crop, but there were beans and also some pokeberries. An occasional scrawny cow stared at him lumpishly from between peeled alder poles. Coaches had passed him 4 times, twice coming and twice going, nearly empty as they came up on him from behind and bypassed him and his mule, fuller as they headed back toward the forests of the north. Now and then a farmer passed with his feet up on the splashboard of his bucka, careful not to look at the man with the guns.
Right back.
It was ugly country. It had showered twice since he had left Pricetown, grudgingly both times. Even the Timothy looked yellow and dispirited. Pass on by country. He had seen no sign of the man in black. Perhaps he had taken a coach. The road made a bend, and beyond it the gunslinger clucked the mule to a stop and looked down at Tull. It was at the floor of a circular, bowl-shaped hollow, a shoddy jewel in a cheap setting. There were a number of lights, most of them clustered around the area of the music. There looked to be 4 streets, 3 running at right angles to the coach road, which was the main avenue of the town. Perhaps there would be a cafe. He doubted it, but perhaps. He clucked at the mule. More houses sporadically lined the road now, most of them still deserted. He passed a tiny graveyard with moldy, leaning wooden slabs overgrown and choked by the rank devil grass. Perhaps 500 feet further on, he passed a chewed sign which said, Tull. The paint was flaked almost to the point of illegibility. There was another further on, but the gunslinger was not able to read that one at all. A fool's chorus of half-stoned voices was rising in the final protracted lyric of Hey Jude. Na, 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 Hey Jude, as he entered the town proper. It was a dead sound, like the wind in the hollow of a rotted tree. Only the prosaic thump and pound of the honky-tonk piano saved him from seriously wondering if the man in black might not have raised ghosts to inhabit a deserted town. He smiled a little at the thought. There were people on the streets, but not many. 3 ladies wearing black slacks and identical high-collared blouses passed by on the opposite boardwalk, not looking at him with pointed curiosity. Their faces seemed to swim above their all but invisible bodies like pallid balls with eyes. A solemn old man with a straw hat perched firmly on top of his head watched him from the steps of a boarded-up mercantile store. A scrawny tailor with a late customer paused to watch him go by. He held up the lamp in his window for a better look. The gunslinger nodded. Neither the tailor nor his customer nodded back. He could feel their eyes resting heavily upon the low-slung holsters that lay against his hips. A young boy, perhaps 13, and a girl who might have been his sissa or his jilly child crossed the street a block up, pausing imperceptibly. Their footfalls raised little hanging clouds of dust. Here in town, most of the street-side lamps worked, but they weren't electric. Their isinglass sides were cloudy with congealed oil. Some had been crashed out. There was a livery with a just hanging-on look to it, probably depending on the coach line for its survival. 3 boys were crouched silently around a marble ring drawn in the dust to one side of the barn's gaping maw, smoking corn-shuck cigarettes. They made long shadows in the yard, lightlessly from its socket. The gunslinger led his mule past them and looked into the dim depths of the barn. One lamp glowed sunkenly. A shadow jumped and flickered as a gangling old man in bib overalls forked loose Timothy hay into the hayloft with big, grunting swipes of his fork. "Hey!" the gunslinger called. The fork faltered, and the hostler looked around with yellow-tinged eyes. "Hey yourself! I got a mule here. Good for you!" The gunslinger flicked a heavy, unevenly milled gold piece into the semi-dark. It rang on the old, chaff-drifted boards and glittered. The hostler came forward, bent, picked it up, squinted at the gunslinger. His eyes dropped to the gun belts, and he nodded sourly. "How long you want him put up?" "A night or 2, maybe longer." "I ain't got no change for gold." "Didn't ask for any." "Shoot up money." The hostler muttered. "What did you say?" "Nothing." The hostler caught the mule's bridle and led him inside. "Rub him down," the gunslinger called. "I expect to smell it on him when I come back. Hear me well." The old man did not turn. The gunslinger walked out to the boys crouched around the marble ring. They had watched the entire